For generations, residents and fellows have endured long hours, relentless performance pressures, sleep deprivation, stigma around asking for help, and a culture that too often equates vulnerability with weakness. It's long overdue that we address these structural stressors intentionally, and it's refreshing to see the ACGME doing just that, embedding well-being expectations directly into accreditation standards and elevating the issue with a dedicated vice president role. There are times in our lives that change the way we see the world. Navigating these challenges can take insight, trusted confidants, or even a coach. Let's explore those moments. In this companion podcast to RX for Success, we will discover ways to learn and write our own success stories together. I'm Dr. Dael Waxman, a physician coach with MD Coaches, and this is Life-Changing Moments. My guest today is Dr. Stuart Slavin, Vice President for Wellbeing at the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education, the ACGME. Dr. Slavin is a pediatrician, educator, and nationally recognized leader whose groundbreaking work has helped shift the culture of medical education toward prioritizing mental health and well-being for physicians in training. And what an excellent choice for this role. Dr. Slavin's landmark contributions have not only shaped the literature on physician wellness, but have led to real, measurable improvements for learners, proving that systems change really is possible. I'm honored to have him here today to share his story, his insights, and what's ahead for physician well-being. So, Dr. Stuart Slavin, welcome to Life-Changing Moments.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really a pleasure to be here with you.
Well, I'm really looking forward to connecting with you about a very important topic. And this show has certainly done a lot of interviews around physician well-being, but we have not yet been able to get somebody who leads this around postgraduate education. And as I said in the introduction, you are the Vice President for Wellbeing at the ACGME, the Accrediting Council in Graduate Medical Education. And I know that there's a lot of other people who work with you in that, but it's really my honor to have you on the show.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I look forward to this.
So let's begin with your story. What drew you into medicine, and how did that eventually lead to a leadership role in physician well-being?
Yeah, it's been a little bit of a circuitous path. In college, I really was very focused on sciences, so I was a biology major, but didn't think that I was going to pursue medicine. My father was a physician and he loved his career, but I thought I would kind of go into some scientific field. But then kind of experiences my summer of my year between junior and senior year of college in a lab and then doing some shadowing. I said, this could work for me, and ended up kind of applying late to medical school and then on to medicine and ultimately pediatric residency at UCLA. The path to well-being took years. I was in many ways a curricular person. So I ended up very early in my career getting a master's degree in education, something that was pretty uncommon for physicians back then. And then ultimately held a number of leadership roles in first pediatric education, then general medical education at UCLA, and then eventually landing at St. Louis University School of Medicine, where I was associate dean for curriculum. And it's there that I kind of, in a completely surprising way, pivoted in my career towards well-being, initially with medical students, and then eventually on in my current position to residents in medicine.
Well, along those lines, was there something in that experience that sparked your interest?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. It was a pivotal moment, which I got to St. Louis University School of Medicine in 2004. I'd been there for about 3 or 4 years. And I'd been reading in the medical education literature work that was coming out of Mayo Clinic, talking about rates of burnout and depression and suicidality amongst medical students. And And I looked at our students and I just thought it's impossible that they're having those rates. I mean, I knew some students suffered, but I thought the vast majority of them seemed happy. They were working hard, but they seemed to be doing fine. And we ended up doing something really important, which was we decided to survey them. And in some ways, I have to admit that I had this hypothesis that maybe just being nice to the medical students was all that was needed. So I, as associate dean for curriculum, would try to create a supportive atmosphere where we listened to students, cared for them, et cetera. And the pivotal moment was the first time I got the results of an end of year well-being mental health survey, not well-being, mental health, in which we found depression and anxiety rates just exactly like other medical school. We also had data from orientation where they looked good. And so immediately the only conclusion I could make was like, we're doing this to them and I'm in charge of it. And this is not okay. And vowed that day that we were going to do something about it. And since then, it's really been the major focus of my career since that time.
I'm sure that's pretty extensive what you did about it, but I'm sure listeners would like to hear. I know we're going to be focusing on residents in a moment, but what was it? What were one or two interventions that you did?
Yeah, I'll be brief, but it was an iterative approach over about 5 years and had two main combinations, which was the environment was the primary driver. So let's try to change the environment to reduce stresses. And so we reduced the amount of class time, we reduced the amount of detail that we were teaching, we went to pass-fail grading. And on the other side, and we freed up time for students to engage in things they cared about, elective opportunities in research and service, et cetera, et cetera. And on the other side, we taught this very brief resilience curriculum, just a few hours in length. And over that 5 years, we were able to decrease depression and anxiety in our first and second year students by 80%, kind of an unprecedented improvement in mental health. Yeah, that was the intervention. And despite reporting that they spent an hour and a half to 2 hours less per day in class or studying than their fellow medical students, their academic performance didn't decline. It actually improved with scores on step one on the national board, increasing and failure rate being cut in half. So yeah, it was a lovely time.
I'm glad you answered that because I was imagining some old timers like myself and older who would be wondering what the outcomes were academically.
Yeah,
so that's no wonder people kind of noticed you after you were able to demonstrate that.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Rhonda Crow, founder and CEO for MD Coaches. Here on RX for Success, we interview a lot of great medical professionals on how they grew their careers, how they overcame challenges, and how they handle day-to-day work. I really hope you're getting a lot of great information. But if you're looking for an answer to a specific problem, management or administration challenge, or if you're feeling just a bit burnt out, like maybe you chose the wrong career, well, then there's a faster way to get the help you need. No, it's not counseling, it's coaching. RX for Success is produced by MD Coaches, a team of physicians who have been where you are. I know you're used to going it alone, but you don't have to. Get the support you need today. Visit us at mymdcoaches.com to schedule your complimentary consultation. Again, that's mymdcoaches.com, because you're not in this alone.
We'll get back to our conversation in just a moment, but first, I want to mention a sponsor who has been with us almost since our beginning. Physician Outlook is a splendid publication created for physicians by physicians. Originally a print and online magazine, it's now a dynamic digital-only platform using storytelling, humor, and community building to help physicians and surgeons reconnect with the art of medicine. Physician Outlook celebrates the entire healthcare team, including nurses, nurse practitioners, and PAs who value physician-led care. As artificial intelligence and corporate overreach threatens the human connection, Physician Outlook remains committed to the sacred physician-patient relationship. Beyond storytelling, Physician Outlook takes action on causes that matter. So join the movement, connect, laugh, be inspired. Visit physicianoutlook.com today. And now let's get back to our interview.
So something migrated into postgraduate education for you. Tell us about what your role as Vice President for Wellbeing at ACGME entails. What is that about?
Oh, I feel so grateful for having this position because, first of all, there's really a fair amount of autonomy that I have in kind of defining the work that I'm doing. And I guess what I would put them into is kind of several buckets. Well, first is resource development. We're in a unique position to create resources and offer resources for residency programs across the country to kind of wrestle with this well-being problem. So that's primary. Also with a colleague at ACGME by the name of Nick Yagmore, kind of actively involved in research related to not just resident well-being, but also recently coordinator, program administrator well-being. So that's a kind of a second piece. And then, talks, workshops, things like that I do both traveling and virtually to try to spread word about, how we can be, approaching this problem in effective ways. So those are kind of the main categories I would say that are my responsibility these days.
I know that ACGME a few years back actually included in the guidelines for graduate medical education some very specific attention to resident well-being. If you can say something about what those are and what the intention behind those are.
Yeah, I don't think it's hyperbole for me to say that I think it was the most, in some ways, progressive accrediting requirements ever made related to well-being, because what it did was accepted very squarely that the main driver was the environment itself. So many of the requirements for colleges and others is related to mental health resources, and do you have enough counselors, and is there access, and things like that. All well and good, really important, but they tend not to pay enough attention, I think, overall to the actual environment that is contributing so much to this distress, burnout, depression, et cetera. So I think that was hugely important that was memorialized in those kind of requirements for residencies and programs and institutions.
So some of your resources that you develop are, I'm assuming, enable programs to be compliant with the guidelines.
Yes, some, though we really try to go beyond that. So right now there's a video module on depression. There's a video module on substance use and abuse that are requirements that residencies are required to teach about. There will be another one coming out about burnout soon. The other, though, is I think what we're trying to do is give residency programs information and resources to address beyond teaching residents about these problems, but to be able to think about these problems and environmental problems and think about strategies for improving them. And one that I should note that I think is really important is probably 5-6 years ago, we started, there's an annual survey of residents and faculty for the accreditation purposes. And a supplement was added to that of 12 well-being questions that had questions both about kind of how exhausted they were, how engaged they were, but also some questions about the learning environment. And that's fed back to residency programs and to the designated institutional officers, officials who oversee those residency programs, and gives them some information so that they can have a sense of, here's a program that's struggling. We need to be looking at it. And that those questions, I would say, aren't really diagnostic, but they're almost like a screening instrument that can kind of ideally find those programs in which the residents and or faculty seem to be struggling.
Stuart, you've mentioned a few times the environment,
Yeah.
and for our listeners who may not necessarily be aware of training environments, or it's been a while since they've been in training environments, can you give an example of what you mean by the environment contributing to the decline in well-being in learners? But then also, can you give an example of an initiative where the environment changed?
Yeah, I would honestly say the drivers are not terribly different than the drivers in healthcare overall. I think they're very similar. They may have a different flavor. They may play out in different ways. There may some that may be more important than they are. What I kind of characterize them, and this is the language I use, though it's not really precise in some way. If you look at the environment, I kind of think of it as a system and as a culture. I think it's pretty widespread knowledge that the healthcare system, many people feel, is just broken. It's just broken. And so a lot of the systems related issues in terms of just overall workload and productivity pressures and documentation burden and administrative burden, inefficiencies in that work, et cetera, are substantial. So that's one side that I think, the residents are working in that same healthcare system that everyone is struggling with. And then the second side, though, and we can kind of go into this in more detail, I think it's the culture of the place. What does it feel like to work there? And just some of the areas that I think are important is do you feel appreciated and valued by your program, your department, by your institution? Do you have any say? Is there autonomy? Do you have, choices? And is your voice heard in kind of when big decisions are made? Is there a sense of community and connection? Do you feel a sense of belonging? It's those kind of cultural factors that I think are really important as well. The one that maybe plays out more in residents than it does for others, though, is frankly feedback. Evaluation and feedback, which we don't think of as a well-being issue, but I think in a lot of ways it is. That if feedback is rarely given or is poorly given, that can have a significant negative impact on how someone is doing. And the converse is true. If there's regular, effective feedback, I think that can have a really salutary effect on well-being as well.
Just to kind of take an example here. So if a program or programs have gone through the ACGME survey, they get some feedback that things are not going so well in terms of resident well-being, and you're positing that there's some environmental issues and culture issues. What are your suggestions around changing some of those?
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that I think I would like to see perhaps characterize a next phase in kind of the well-being movement, which is, I think people often look at the problem, and I think this comes from the C-suite. Just tell me what to do, as if there's a magic bullet that if you just do this programming, everything will be fine. And I think it's an inappropriate way, an inaccurate way of looking at the problems. And what I would say is there are micro environments that exist in which the threats to well-being are completely different. So you can have a hospital, and the threats to well-being for a pediatrician are not only, maybe, but are likely to be completely different from that of a neurosurgeon. So that I think we need to get away from kind of these one-size-fits-all well-being approaches and to start to dive in to say, what's needed here? What are the threats to well-being within this program, within this department, within the specialty, and how can we address those? I think if we have that kind of targeted approach rather than this kind of blanket approach, I think we'd be making more progress. And the thing I would add to that quickly too, I think with the reason my work at St. Louis U, it was so effective is we didn't just throw one problem at it. Every year we tried to make it a better place, and we tried to, it was an iterative process that was informed by the people we were trying to help. It wasn't us coming in and say, oh, they need this, they need that. It was really in concert and in dialogue with those students that we came up with the solutions overall. And I think we need to move more in that direction, and not just GME, but I think the well-being work writ large. Yeah.
Absolutely. Along those lines, I on this show, Paula Davis, who's written a book around beating burnout at work, is the book. She's had a sequel to that, but she posits that not only positive, but she showed that there are pockets in every organization that are doing very well, and there are pockets that are not doing very well at all. But it's the same organization.
Yes, absolutely.
So she really focuses her hypothesis more around teamwork, but it's attending to the things you just mentioned, belonging, and what's the environment, some of the environmental issues.
Yeah, let me add to that though quickly.
Sure,
that I think one of the factors which Tate Janefeld has studied and I think really demonstrated is some huge part of the portion of the variance of whether you have burnout or not is simply the behavior of your supervisor. So it sounds like it really fits with those
Yeah.
microenvironments is that teamwork. What's the leader of that team? What kind of environment are they creating? And I think as we look at medicine, I think it's important to, there are many leaders. There's, the department chair and the division chiefs and the program directors, and the faculty. But what we also have to remember is, the residents, senior resident is a leader, and the intern can be a leader of the medical students, and trying to figure out, how can they bring their best selves to this role, I think is so important.
You having just said what you just said about looking at microenvironments and addressing the small, I do wonder if is any research that you are conducting, ACGME is conducting, similar to what you did at St. Louis University with the medical school, that you care to share any outcomes about some of the interventions that you've all put into place.
Yeah, it's not us. I mean, that's what's different about my position at ACGME versus St. Louis U is like I had control over what was done. So all we can do at ACGME largely, unless it's accreditation issues, somebody's out of compliance with the accreditation, it's really up to those folks themselves to determine how best to address the situation. And again, I think we're going to continue to try to develop resources that will help them in that work, so that they aren't having to invent it at each place. That we give them kind of strategies to do just that.
Are there any examples that come to mind of places that you're aware of that?
Yeah, I'll describe a couple models out there that I think are interesting. So the first one, I'll just say Mount Sinai Hospital or Medical Center and Medical School have developed a program called Champions Program, a well-being champions program. So in each of the department, and they have more than 60 of these champions, they have people who have dedicated time and training to help program directors, residency directors, department chairs develop well-being initiatives. And what's beautiful about that is then it is really responsive to that department's environment. And I think they're having some very positive impact there. And others are starting to take that model and use it. The other is also one is HCA Healthcare. The big for-profit medical system in which they're investing substantially in particularly well-being of residents, and theirs is grounded in theory, which I think is important. And theirs is really around self-determination theory. That if you support residents in the areas of competence and connectedness and autonomy, well-being will emerge. So they're doing some very interesting creative work using that model and something called job demand resources, where let's see if we can help you have the resources needed to meet the demands of the hospital. So those are a couple, and there are others out there that are really starting to do some very exciting work. I'm looking forward to seeing more emerge in coming years.
That's great. That's awesome. I want to shift a little bit from well-being to mental health. And it sounds like that's something that you experienced with the medical students. I know the current generation of trainees is a little different than some of the older generations around their view of seeking mental health. Is stigma still an issue from your perspective about seeking assistance?
It is, but it's less so. What we also have to recognize is stigma itself can be a local phenomenon. So if you are in a clinical department where the clear message is, don't complain, don't show weakness, et cetera, that may reduce help seeking in residents in that program compared to another where at orientation, you might have a faculty member share their story of having suffered depression and gotten help, et cetera. So that local environment is really huge. I think what we've tried to do to say, stigma is falling, but it's not the only barrier to accessing mental health care. And we actually have an article that came out in JGME, the Journal of Graduate Medical Education, and a resource page devoted to describing ways to overcome barriers to mental health care, seeking mental health care in residency, that I think which is an important resource, because we do know that large numbers of residents suffer from mental health issues and should be seeking care. And frankly, many of them come in having a history of mental health problems. I mean, with this adolescent and young adult mental health crisis in this country, medical students aren't escaping that. So there's vulnerability on the part of entering residence these days. And I have to say really clearly, I don't blame them. They're products of what came before them. So I think that's an extraordinarily important thing to do. And one that we've also pushed on, just to say a bit more, is in the transition to residency. It is absolutely clear that the first 3 months of the first year of residency poses a unique threat to mental health. And one piece of evidence to support that is the highest suicide rate in residency is the first three months of that first year. So we also have a resource focusing on supporting residents in the transition to residency when they are so vulnerable from a mental health standpoint.
You and I were both residents at one point, and I think one of the challenges is identifying what it is that I'm experiencing. Is this just the stress of residency, or am I having anxiety, or am I having depression, or a little bit of all the above?
Yes.
Are there some ways to discern that for residents in training?
Yeah, no question. One of the requirements we were talking about program requirements is that there are tools that residents can and must be able to access that they can screen themselves for mental health conditions. No question. And there are different ones that people are using around the country. So that is something that we hope people are utilizing, because I think sometimes just the recognition that you're struggling, and that this isn't okay, can be hard for folks, without question.
Yeah, which kind of leads to my next question. What would you say to a resident or fellow who feels overwhelmed but fears seeking help?
Yeah, it's challenging, because I guess I would say there are multiple layers to that. One, and most important, should feel no shame whatsoever in seeking care. It's not a sign of weakness to reach out to therapists. And second, I think, is, if you're struggling, you're not alone. There are others who are struggling. And one of the kind of behaviors I've seen in medicine, which is pretty common, is something called Stanford Duck. I don't know if you ever heard Stanford Duck, but Stanford undergrads came up with this term. And basically, if you imagine this duck floating along a pond or a lake, it's so serene, not moving a muscle, and you look under the surface, and their feet are paddling like crazy. There's strong social pressure to hide your distress, to hide your worry, your struggles, and the problem with that is, if you really are struggling and you look at all your fellow residents and everybody seems on top of it, you think you're the only one, and it's not the case. You're surrounded by Stanford Ducks who may be struggling as well. So don't feel like you're the only one struggling. And I guess that if it's hard to kind of make the step of reaching out to make an appointment with a mental health provider, find somebody. Hopefully there's at least one person in your program, whether it's a fellow resident, a senior resident, a chief resident, a beloved faculty member who you can just meet with and say, gosh, what do you think? What should I do? I think that intermediary step, and hopefully everybody in residency has a person like that. That'd be wonderful if that was the case.
Yeah, and the other, I'm also aware of some programs where they actually have senior residents kind of trained, if you will, to be on the lookout for people who are struggling, and then to actually proactively reach out to them.
No question. And I think that's something that should be a must everywhere in some ways, is basic psychological first aid.
Yeah.
How do you help somebody? And you would think, oh my gosh, physicians would be great at that, but not necessarily, and there are specific tools you can use that are very easy to use that I think should be ubiquitous training in residencies and for faculty, no question.
So this has been great. I really appreciate your the energy you are bringing to postgraduate education. It's so important, because as we've seen in a lot of authors, the kind of things that we learn in our medical training, the patterns that we learn, the approaches, the modeling that we get, kind of set us up for our professional life. So when you said, frankly, the problems with residency are the problems with healthcare in general, and we're at risk for having those persist if we don't learn some different ways of doing things. So I really appreciate all the good work that you're doing. And so, what's ahead? What are any new strategies or models, or just in general, what's ahead for your division of the ACGME?
I think the push is really on, well, we're actually doing some work that hopefully will provide the data back to the programs and institutions from those well-being questions in a different way that puts individuals into kind of clusters, so that it isn't just, oh, how did they answer these 12 questions, but looking at these questions like what percentage of the residents and or the faculty are kind of engaged and not exhausted? How many of them are not engaged? So that we're going to be hopefully rolling out next year, that I think will give people kind of more actionable kind of information that can be really useful as they're trying to figure out what that problem is. I hope that we will also be supporting what I think is really needed is two things, which is this diagnostic approach. There are a lot of resources being paid to look at, to measure well-being of individuals, whether it's burnout or well-being index or tools like that. I don't think enough being spent focusing on diagnosing what's the problem with the environment. And I hope that occurs. And out of that, I hope, is kind of this iterative approach, where it isn't just like, oh, let's throw something at it and call it a day, but that it is an ongoing approach that is informed by the specific stressors in that microenvironment, in that program, in that department. I think if we move towards that, I think we're going to be more effective in our work overall.
If you could wave a magic wand, what's the one change you would make in medical education or healthcare in general that would improve well-being?
I think what I just said, but I'll add to that, because one thing we haven't talked about today is we've talked a lot about the environment. There's also a dangerous movement sometimes from some residents, and I don't blame them for having this perspective. There's some who believe it's all the environment. Don't look at me. I'm not part of the problem or solutions. And one of the things that has fascinated me since my days at St. Louis U is these things that are called problematic, or that I call problematic mindsets. Things like imposter phenomenon and maladaptive perfectionism that can have a profound impact on how someone experiences that environment and can add substantially to the distress. And I think, again, one of the pieces of or factors that was so effective at St. Louis U is it wasn't just the environment we dealt with. We said life is stressful, and being a medical student, a resident, future physician is stressful. We want to help you develop some skills to manage these problematic mindsets and cognitive distortions in a way so that they cause you less distress. So I think both of those things I'd love to see continue to move forward, and that we give people tools to support helping people manage those mindsets. And we actually have video workshops and podcasts just focusing on that kind of cognitive restructuring that very few residents really, I think, have been exposed to, is basic tools of being able to recognize these maladaptive thoughts and changing them in a way that kind of causes less distress. So it's kind of a both and, I think, that we need to attack this problem with.
Have you ever met a resident that did not experience imposter syndrome?
No. And I've got to tell a quick story, which is a physician, and I'll quote him here, Eric Nadel at Mass General. I was giving a talk and about imposter, and he said, Stuart, you have to realize the opposite end of imposter is not no imposter, it's arrogance. And so I think for everybody to remember that a little imposter is healthier than being on the arrogant side of things. When you're arrogant, you often miss things, you make mistakes. So that it's like a little dose of imposter is something completely healthy to have.
I agree with you. I actually I retired from academic family medicine a few years ago, and I gave a little talk to my department and residents, and I actually said exactly that. I said, imposter syndrome doesn't ever really go away, and I think that's a good thing.
No.
But where it's not a good thing is when it's really causing you not to function well. I want to make sure that we're saying that.
Yeah. Right. If you're too high on that continuum and they're really, it's a distorted self-perception, you got a problem. And a quick story there is I have done these workshops with residents sometimes. And one of the things I do is have them rate themselves on each of these mindsets. And then I have them turn to the person next to them and compare these worksheets. Like, have you experienced imposter? And it's just stunning sometimes. I mean, I've heard like a resident like practically yell, how can you have an imposter? You're like the most amazing person that I've ever seen. And it's a trap that we can really fall into, is these narratives we tell about ourselves that are just not accurate and that can contribute to the distress in this highly demanding, perfectionistic cultures that we live in.
And going back to something you said earlier in our talk is to recognize that you're not alone in this, that everybody's walking around feeling the same thing.
Absolutely. It was funny because when I do those workshops, I think just that experience has therapeutic value because people don't talk about it. And then they think, oh my gosh. I had a quick story again, if you don't mind, which is I gave a talk and at the end, a third-year student about these mindsets. And she said, Dr. Slavin, thank you so much. You've given me a vocabulary to understand my thinking. I used to just think I was screwed up, and it is. I think to manage these mindsets, you have to have the vocabulary so you can start seeing them and realizing it's a false narrative, and you can replace it with an accurate one.
Well, this has been wonderful. And like I do with all my guests, I just want to give you an opportunity. Is there anything that you want to impart to the audience that I have not asked you about?
I almost never say no, but I think I'm going to. I think you did such a great job of really covering a wide territory. And I'm glad in that last phase we got to the mindsets, because I think while we focused a lot on the environment, we also have to recognize how the individual engages with that environment can have an important kind of impact on their own well-being. So yeah, I think you've done a masterful job of interviewing, and just so appreciate you having me on. This has been a pleasure.
And I so appreciate your willingness to be on Life-Changing Moments. You're doing exceptional work. I'm sure that this has quite a ripple effect across all of medical education, and hopefully not only hopefully, but I'm sure for healthcare provision and healthcare systems as we move forward. So thank you for all the great work you're doing. And again, thank you for being a guest today.
Yeah, my pleasure. And thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for tuning in to Life-Changing Moments. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to rate us 5 stars and leave a review. Doing so helps our podcast reach more listeners. Have something to share? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Visit the MD Coaches community on Facebook groups. This dynamic virtual space is a place to continue discussion about life-changing moments and perhaps share some life-changing moments of your own. Join the conversation today.